Good to talk to you guys and have you all on the same call. It's been something I've been wanting to do for a while, so I'm glad to have you all here. And again, please feel free to speak up throughout the presentation. I'm going to be talking you through a number of policy opportunities we have, but I'm very interested in hearing your feedback. You're all unmuted again, and so you're welcome to mute on your end, either through GoToWebinar or by doing it on your phone. And again, ask clarification questions as we go, but we'll also have some discussion time blocked off at the end to talk about how we want to nail down our 2 to 4 priorities or so. And also, I'm going to be giving a high-level overview of the policies and recommendations that I shared with you in that spreadsheet last week, with the caveat that at this point, I'm not an expert on each of the policies, and so if we get some really in-the-weeds questions, I may have to look into those and follow up. So we're going to start by talking through some general project updates. This will include the things in addition to the policy agenda. And then I wanted to hear some of your thoughts on how we want to prioritize these, where you see them as relevant. And then we'll go through the overview of policy opportunities, the 17 policies I sent over. And then we'll end with a discussion on which of this number of policies or recommendations at the federal level that we want to focus on.
Hey, Diana, can you let us know who else is on the phone?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't really see that. So right now we have Ashley Pearl from Aspen, Karen Edwards from Lake Tahoe, and Matt Abbott from Park City. And we also have Mary Beth from Durango is supposed to be joining, as well as Christian Bertuglia from Vail. So they both responded yes, so they might be jumping on later, but I'm also recording it for the reference. And actually, because there's just a few of us on the line, Ashley, Karen, and Matt, do you want to say anything? Or I believe you've all spoken a number of times in the past, but would you like to reintroduce yourselves or say anything in addition to what I just mentioned?
No. Hey, guys. Good to talk to you.
Yeah, it's nice to reconnect with both of you.
Great. All right. So a few project updates on the campaigns that we worked on in 2014. One of those was the Wildfire Disaster Funding Act. And it was a mix of a success and a big disappointment at the end of the year. So through the Mountain to PACT together, we submitted 28 letters to Congress and met with senatorial staff on 4 different occasions. And overall, the Wildfire Disaster Funding Act came very, very close to making the December omnibus spending bill, but it was removed just days before. And so this language was taken out at the last minute, which is very disappointing, but we have a sense that there is because it got so far in the process, and there is very widespread bipartisan support, that we are enthusiastic that this is it's just a matter of time before this passes. On last Friday, Representative Simpson from Idaho reintroduced the bill into the 114th Congress, and it's been tweaked just a little bit to address the new Congress and the Republican perspective a little bit more, but we are enthusiastic on that. Also, we submitted, particularly through Lake Tahoe and Park City, submitted comments on the Forest Service proposed directive on ski area water rights. And as I've talked to you guys about in the past, it's the policy of the Forest Service looking at updating its permitting process to ensure, looking at it in the conversation of climate change and with expected impacts of climate change, to ensure that ski areas have the access they need to snowmaking, but then also that if ski areas end up selling off the leases to future owners, that they don't actually remove the water rights from the area so that the water stays local. And that is still in, Forest Service is still in negotiations or integrating the public comment into the final directive and negotiating with ski areas behind the scenes. So we're still kind of on a wait and see with them. And also just a general kind of recognition of the new Congress, which is now, the House and Senate is now majority Republican, and we lost some key champions, particularly Mark Udall from Colorado. And while it could be one perspective, could be a little doom and gloom about the climate change agenda and the resilience and natural resource agenda in the new Congress, there is an opportunity. There is an opportunity that I've heard a little bit more where looking at spending and it seems like Democrats and Republicans are interested in not just having these yearly budget fights and continuing resolutions, but rather actually wanting to put together longer-term appropriations bills and spending for specific agencies. So this is something where there is a lot of overlap with what we're trying to achieve around funding and community support through federal funding with agencies. So that's one aspect of, I think, hope, and because we are going to have a majority Republican House and Senate, this will, there is a, historically, with majorities across, it seems to be a little bit more success in getting things done. So that's on the sort of campaign policy front updates. Unless you guys have any questions, I will talk a little bit about just more Mountain PACT behind the scenes with funding and bandwidth. So currently Mountain PACT is struggling on the funding front, but based on the support we have from your communities, as well as the fiscal sponsors here, Business Council, we have enough funding for quarter-time staff time support through July. And so that's still a pretty good portion to be able to get things done and has been consistent throughout the year. But if you have any ideas, we're continuing to fundraise, so welcome any suggestions you have. And also, as we review what we want to be focusing on in 2015, keep the sort of bandwidth in the back of your mind about roughly quarter-time staff support throughout the year. And then lastly, we have the website. So I'm just wrapping up with the web designer final touches this week, and so that should be ready to go. And thanks to, in particular, Ashley, Karen, and Matt for providing the photos, which was a huge help and really beautified the website. So I'm going to be spending the bulk of this talking about specific policy priorities and where we want to dig in. But before that, in addition to pursuing a policy agenda, I want to hear your thoughts on other aspects of the Mountain PACT that we want to focus on and prioritize. So this could be, Mountain PACT could be hosting more regular facilitated discussions across your communities so that you're getting together on a monthly basis to talk about economic development, climate resilience, or other issues. So that's one option. Another is starting to think about how we can maximize this knowledge from the Mountain PACT, or sort of the progress that we're making within the Mountain PACT, but also begin to better build capacity within your local government so that we're institutionalizing a lot of that in addition to moving forward with the Mountain PACT. So what can we do to better support you guys in your roles and keeping you as part of the conversation and well informed? And then also I've heard from Ashley with Aspen about the economic impact research, and they've had a few conversations with one tourism economic consulting firm, and they're interested in maybe doing something along those lines. So those are three other, in addition to the policy agenda, three other programmatic directions or priorities that we could be pursuing simultaneously. But I'd like to hear from you if there's either other ideas or of these, what you're interested in and what you might think, how you think these could look as they get implemented.
Hey, Diana, before we jump into that, I had a question about the website. Is that mainly aimed at the public or at gathering more fundraising, or is it like a login type website where we can go for resources, or what should we expect to see when that goes live?
Yeah, so the website I think is going to be more of a public face as well as a funding face, and something for as a resource for you guys. I think it won't be as much. At this point, it's not going to be a login situation where you'd access information. But more so as this is what the Mountain PACT is, this is who's involved, this is what we're pursuing, more of a public face.
Great, thank you.
Sorry.
Did we have
can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you guys hear me? Okay. This is Karen. Did you want some ideas right now?
Yes, I definitely. So I think we kind of take the next 5 minutes or so to talk through the programmatic priorities, and I'd love to hear from your thoughts on how we want to integrate these options or other ideas.
So I don't have anything in particular, but I was just thinking, in terms of a value add for the Mountain Pact, are there any things that we could do that would have sort of the benefit of economies of scale? Essentially, like if we're all, if there's something that we all wanted to do anyway on our own, and it would be like less expensive for us to all, to do it if there were more, sort of more people involved. I don't really have any ideas right now, but I guess just something to think about. I mean, it's potentially, I guess an economic impact study.
Mm-hmm.
They benefit from economies of scale, but if there's anything else.
That's a great perspective. And Matt and Ashley, do you have anything, does anything come to mind for you?
I think the first thing that came to mind was the economic impact study, if that's something that would be valuable to everyone else. Aside from that, I don't know, maybe there's something around like resiliency planning with, maybe there's like a messaging piece of that. Like we just have our climate impacts assessment that it like applies to a lot of our region here, so it applies to a lot of other cities that are in the Mountain Pact, and I don't know if there's like key takeaways from that can be messaged in the same way to all mountain towns, or just kind of throwing out ideas here, but it seems like there's probably economies of scale, and we should keep that on our minds as we move forward.
Yeah, this is Karen. I would agree with that. I think how we message resiliency planning and policies is something that a lot of us don't have a great handle on, and it's something that definitely could be transferable from mountain town to mountain town.
This is Matt, and I definitely would third all those recommendations. Economic impact, and then we've also been doing some ecosystem services analysis, which has been helpful for putting a price on resiliency planning. Like if we had a fire, what would that cost us? Which could definitely be applicable to other ski areas. And
you're already doing that? You guys are already doing that?
Yeah. And that's through a volunteer.
Internally, or like a graduate student, or?
She's actually a consultant. She's worked for the oil industry, so she's paying her penance through us.
Great. So I heard looking at messaging as well as the economic impact study, and that's interesting to hear about the ecosystem service analysis you're pursuing that. And so maybe, would there be interest, I guess, in also just having regular, maybe a monthly call with all of you on the line talking about maybe a specific topic around resilience or something else along those lines? I'm sensitive to everybody's busy schedule and maybe not wanting necessarily another conference call, but it also could be of huge value and getting those sort of ideas and juices flowing on your end. Is that something, would you guys be interested in that, or is that maybe something that should be a lower priority?
This is Karen. I would be interested in that, but I would say maybe like every 2 or 3 months, not every month.
Okay.
Yeah, I just looking at this slide you have up here, all of these things look awesome, but given that you said we have pretty small currently amount of staff time to work on it, it seems to me like the real value of the Mountain Pact is keeping us updated on what's happening at the federal policy level. And I think any of this other stuff is kind of icing on the cake. But I guess second tier would be connecting with other members on like a very specific relevant topic. So I'm fearful I think it'd be cool to talk every couple months, but as long as we have like a very clear kind of agenda on what we cover, you know, so that that there is value out of that.
Okay.
Just because I know Matt and I are both part of the Western Adaptation Alliance, and we have calls about resiliency planning, and I think that we're all kind of getting it from a lot of different places. And so to me, the real value is just knowing who I can call if I want to talk about this stuff, and not necessarily, you know, having a scheduled call. And so getting to know members, I think, is to me more valuable.
That's really helpful. All right. Well, this is some good feedback. I'm going to go ahead and move on, but we can definitely come back to any of this as we go. So now I'm going to jump into talking through the different policy opportunities. I'll give you guys a little bit of background on how I derived the different policies I identified, but then just as a few things to keep in mind before we jump in is the Mountain Pact's aim or focus is to be a coalition of high-profile mountain towns working together to build environmental and economic resilience through a shared voice on federal policy. So thinking about the different priorities and how they fit into that is something that I've considered when I prepared this, and hope you'll keep in the back of your mind. Also, I'm going to be presenting the policies in order of my recommended priorities, which doesn't necessarily mean that that's the order we need to go in by any means, but just looking at a criteria of what our conversations with you, conversations with federal, different federal agencies that identified where they thought the biggest levers we could pull, and then also what aligns with this project vision. And then also something is for a lot of these policies is we can often get the most bang for our buck by joining national campaigns and bringing the mountain resort town perspective to those. So that's something I'm thinking about in the policies we end up choosing is where can we partner as well beyond mountain communities to join forces and make our voice part of that larger effort. So for your background, the priorities identified came from a number of sources. First off, I had calls and conversations with each of you. Also had conversations with staff at USDA/Forest Service, Interior, BLM, Housing Urban Development, and then the White House Center for Environmental Quality, as well as the EPA. And then a couple NGOs I spoke with as well. So really those conversations were looking at what is on the docket for 2015, what is most relevant to mountain communities, and where can we, what's the most likely, or where can we jump in and likely see success. And then something in those conversations too, what really came up was the federal government is very, it sounds like excited, that's a bit of an emotive word to use, but I think they were very excited about these two reports that just came out late in about November, October of last year, and they're going to be guiding the federal agencies going forward. And so one of those reports is the State, Local, and Tribal Leaders Task Force on Climate Preparedness and Resilience, and they came out with their recommendations to the President. So this task force, a lot of I would say maybe even half of the policies identified are recommendations that came out of this task force. And it's kind of the first of its kind, and it's a pretty big deal. It's the Obama signed an executive order establishing the task force in 2013, and basically getting together mayors, governors, county officials, and tribal leaders from around the country to spend a year meeting regularly talking about community needs for dealing with the impacts of climate change, and then ending with a number of recommendations for how the federal government can start preparing and supporting climate resilience. And the members of the task force definitely were not representative of Mountain Pact communities. I think the ones that are relevant is we had Governor Jerry Brown of California, Mayor Ralph Becker of Salt Lake City, and Mayor Karen White-Cunette of Fort Collins. So that's kind of the closest it gets. So something that came out of that then, or to consider, or I've been considering as I've been reading through this and analyzing the policies, is that the mountain perspective isn't naturally going to be on the next stage of actually advocating for implementation of these recommendations. So I think that's a role we can jump in and start looking at making sure that it's not just focused on the primarily urban areas that were represented in the task force. And then the other report is the Council on Climate Preparedness and Resilience, and the priority agenda on enhancing climate resilience of America's natural resources. So this is a series, essentially this also came out of an executive order from the president where he asked federal agencies, and I think there's maybe 3 or 4 cases, to come together and develop actions around climate resilience. And so this is one of the series of the 3 or 4 reports with a focus on natural resources. And so these actions are, well, there's a suite of actions to take to enhance the resilience of America's natural resources. And the administration is already committed to these actions. So rather than being a recommendation, they are a step where they're saying we're going to do this. However, there's going to be a big gap between saying that they're going to do it in a report and actually implementing it, especially as we have the 2016 presidential election coming up. And so an opportunity for the Mountain Pact to engage in this would also just be making sure that both mountain communities are part of the conversation, part of the rulemaking or drafting process, and then also that these actions, the actions that we support, get underway as soon as possible, particularly before the next administration. So with that, let's start jumping into these policies. And so this is, the next few slides are identifying the policies. They're going to be a little text heavy, so feel free to speak up and ask any questions as we go. But the first policy I'm looking at is from a recommendation pulled out of the task force, and it's that the USDA and DOI should require climate resilience planning for natural resources. State and regional planning processes such as the state wildlife action plans and state forest action plans should be required to consider impacts of climate change and address resilience priorities. So why I think this is particularly relevant to mountain communities is that it would further integrate climate preparedness practices such as wildfire prevention and water resource management into neighboring state and federal lands. And so I'm going to run through these again. Again, ask questions as they come up, but I'll just power through and then we'll talk through the which ones we're most interested in at the end. So this next one is the Wildfire Disaster Funding Act. And this is, I still place this on a high priority list because I think its likelihood for success is relatively strong. And the Wildfire Disaster Funding Act, if it did pass, it would not only benefit specifically wildfire, but it would really, we'd see a pretty generous inflow of cash across the Forest Service and different land manager or federal land management agencies. Because right now, with all the funding and the cost of wildfire prevention and suppression, rather not prevention, just suppression, it ends up taking away funding and borrowing from other programs. So this is things like recreation. So creating a FEMA-like funding structure for wildfire suppression would really just open up the Forest Service budget in a way that we haven't seen for the last 11 years about. I think something like 10 out of the last 11 years, the Forest Service has had to spend outside of there and borrowed from other programs in order to suppress wildfire. So I think that's a lot of bang and a lot of funding that would end up going to communities with neighboring federal lands. And so it didn't make it into the 2014 Omnibus spending bill, but Mountain Pact has been working with a national coalition led by the Nature Conservancy, and the bill right now has been reframed to address the 114th Congress, and there is a pretty fair amount of support for it. So this next one is a task force recommendation, and it's to integrate climate resilience and adaptation planning into invasive species programs and partnerships. So this includes the National Invasive Species Council, the Invasive Species Advisory Council, the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, and similar efforts in integrated pest management programs. So this is going to be one of a couple invasive species focused recommendations that are of interest, and I think just this looks at supporting mitigating the spread of invasive species caused by climate change. So for example, pine beetle. And alpine mountain communities are very susceptible to this, to invasive species changes as a result of climate change. So I think there'd be a very compelling angle to pull on this one if we did do outreach around it. So next is increased regional monitoring of the spread of invasive species, analysis of pests and potential threats, eradication methods and control methods, such as biocontrol technology, through enhanced research, identification, interagency coordination, and education efforts. So this is sort of a blanket invasive species recommendation to really just be investing more heavily from research to actual interagency coordination and education and implementation. And then our third of the 3 invasive species recommendations is to comes from actually the Council on Climate Preparedness and Resilience, and it looks at supporting early detection and rapid response program, which includes assisting states in creating emergency response fund to increase the capacity of interagency and interjurisdictional teams to tackle emerging invasive species issues across landscapes and jurisdictions. So it's addressing invasive species through the specific early detection and rapid response program. And this would likely include development of a plan for creating an emergency response fund, so this has a funding component as well. And I think working on this, as with most of the policies, but it's looking at bringing the mountain perspective in during this early drafting process or moving forward with implementation. So next we have provide technical support and guidance on how to conduct assessments of vulnerability of water infrastructure to climate change impacts and incorporate climate change resilience into water resource planning and project design and related economic development planning. So the relevance here to mountain PACT communities would be the potential to include your perspective into the drafting process of the technical support and guidance implementation. So potentially trying to get in there so that there could be additional focus or the criteria for who gets selected on technical support and assessments would include eligibility requirements that support mountain communities. And this one is a task force recommendation. The next is a recommendation that USDA, DOI, and FEMA and other agencies reduce the human and ecosystem vulnerability to wildfires by prioritizing pre-fire forest thinning and post-fire forest restoration to address forest health needs. And this would have a particular emphasis to vulnerable watersheds. And then as well, wildfire risk to adjacent communities can be reduced by providing resources and assistance for fire-safe homes and communities. So this is a general wildfire recommendation to implement and be more consistent with pre-fire forest thinning, forest restoration post-fire, and community preparedness. And so the benefit here to mountain communities would be federal investment and prioritization of wildfire prevention in forests and communities. So number 8 is from the task force to expand the Partnership for Sustainable Communities and other place-based programs to explicitly incorporate and encourage climate resilience by supporting the development of local laboratories where approaches to sustainable and resilient energy, infrastructure, transportation, natural infrastructure can be tested and disseminated more broadly. So this is a research-focused recommendation working through the Partnership for Sustainable Communities. And this has the potential to bring attention to mountain communities during the drafting process, which could augment the eligibility for funding and support for other programs to improve access to affordable housing while building resiliency. So number 9 is USDA and other federal land managers should support research programs that monitor how climate is affecting agricultural and natural resources in the near and long term. So this is a recommendation that asks USDA and the federal land manager to take to actually focus more on research programs that look at climate change in natural resource areas, both short term and long term. So before I go into number 10, we're about halfway through of them. Any questions so far? Okay. So then with number 10, it supports the delivery of downscaled climate data and the development of regional and sub-regional impact projections and mapping to ensure the availability of data at a resolution that is relevant to local decision makers. So this would be a particular relevance to your local planners so that they actually can have access to data that makes sense and to be planning, have access to data that helps them plan on a more local scale. Number 11 is task force recommendation to assign a higher priority to climate resilience programs and projects when administering federal grant programs related to water supply, wastewater, and water resource projects. So this would include EPA's Clean Drinking Water and Drinking Water State and Tribal Revolving Funds. So these would support policies that would benefit resilience projects around the country, especially those that relate to water. And that there could be a natural, I think that depending on how this is actually, where the next steps of this goes, I think often water policies tend to focus on urban areas where a lot of the water is consumed, but if there's a way to get in there early on and integrate it so that the upstream users or upstream water resources were integrated, that could have relevance to mountain communities. Number 12 is support the development of PACE programs, that's the Property Assessed Clean Energy, that address locally relevant energy efficiency projects, renewable energy installations, and weatherization improvements. So PACE is a finance mechanism for energy efficiency, renewable energy, and water conservation upgrades to buildings. And PACE pays for things like new heating and cooling systems, solar panels, insulation, et cetera. And it does this across almost any type of property, homes, commercial, industrial, et cetera. And then 13 is to support the reauthorization bill that includes smart growth to replace the Moving Ahead for Progress in the 21st Century Act. So supporting a reauthorization bill that has includes smart growth to MAP 21. And so currently MAP 21 lacks, its main criticisms are that it lacks quite a bit in any smart growth aspects and diluted it from the previous version. And so this would be working and supporting an alternative transportation option that emphasizes smart growth like pedestrian, bicycle, rail, compact development, et cetera. So the next, and let's see, the next three, and we'll have one after that. These are very conservation focused. And I ended up prioritizing those lower on the scale for a few different reasons, but one is that I'm not sure conservation is as relevant to your communities, and there's also a pretty solid efforts and support and capacity around conservation programs currently. Not necessarily at the federal level, but in terms of the campaign side. So I don't know if that was the most bang for the buck with the Mountain Pact. That said, a lot of these programs, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts because they could bring funding into your communities, and there could be projects that I'm not aware of. So the first is Support Land and Water Conservation Fund program. This program provides matching grants to states and local governments for the acquisition and development of public outdoor recreation areas and facilities. So the program creates the idea behind it is that it creates a nationwide legacy of high quality recreation areas and facilities and to stimulate non-federal investments in the protection and maintenance of recreation areas in the U.S. And this bill was, this program was funded in the Cromnibus, December 2014 Cromnibus, and it's funded through 2015. So it's good for now, but I think as we look at the next funding structure, if Congress wants to avoid another budget blowout at the end of the year, one aspect could be how does this get funded in a more sustainable way. Next is looking at the Forest Legacy Program, which was it's designed to protect environmentally important forest lands that are threatened by conversion to non-forest uses. So it provides federal funding to conservation easements and fee simple purchases. So this may or may not be relevant to your communities in terms of whether or not, I think a lot of this is conversion of forest land to agricultural purchases or purposes or commercial development. And so that's where it would really come into play as relevance if there are those types of land conversions happening in your area. And then the third is the Community Forest Program. And this is a program that authorizes the Forest Service to provide financial assistance to local governments, tribal governments, and qualified nonprofit entities to establish community forests that provide continuing and accessible community benefits. And what's interesting is the community benefits here are defined somewhat vaguely, but they include economic, ecological, educational, and recreational benefits. So this would be a fee simple program to support community forests. And then the last policy I'll be going over is the Marketplace Fairness Act. And this is one that came up in conversations, and it's proposed legislation that would enable the state governments to collect sales taxes and use taxes from remote retailers with no physical presence in their state, looking at areas where outside of where online retailers have a good financial presence in the community that often override the state taxes previously collected from local brick and mortar stores. So this bill would, if passed, it would increase revenue to local governments and promote business. I did put it as a lower priority because in some ways it strays from the Mountain Pact's vision, but that said, if this was something that, like any of these, I welcome your thoughts and we can rearrange as needed. This Marketplace Fairness Act it was in the 113th Congress, and it has not been proposed yet. There were only a couple days into the new Congress. And I wasn't able to get any intel on what the sort of plans are for the next steps on this. And so I imagine that information will be coming to light in the next few months, particularly as this is a very popular potential piece of legislation. So we just talked through at rapid speed 17 policies or potential recommendations that we can pursue as a Mountain Pact. And all of this is in the spreadsheet I sent over. And so from there, I was hoping we can spend, we're pretty good on time, so it's only 10:40 Pacific time right now. So if we could spend the next maybe 10, 15 minutes talking through and pulling out what is most important to your community so that we can nail down the ones that I'm actually going to really focus and make sure that we have a quality over quantity in terms of impact.
Diana, before we jump into specifics, I have a general question. This is really great. Thank you. The spreadsheet and the slides were really helpful. I'm a little bit just still trying to wrap my head around federal policy and learning about it, but it seems like some of these are acts that are either going to be introduced or have been. Some of them are really clearly defined programs, and then there's a lot of these that are, really just straight out of the resiliency or task force recommendations. Do you know, like, if those are going to take the form of a bill to be proposed, or they're just going to sit there until somebody takes them up? Some of those more just kind of like integrate climate resilience and adaptation planning into invasive species programs. Like, I'd be kind of curious what that looks like, when it actually happens, or what we would actually be supporting.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So thank you for asking that. So there's, to take a step back, there's a few different angles I see here, and so there's only maybe 2 or even 3 actual pieces of legislation that would go through Congress in this, and part of the reason there is that Congress has a very bad track record on actually getting anything done, and so we see a lot of what I've heard from both, particularly from NGOs around campaigning and climate resilience, is that I think there's a lot of hope for climate resilience happening, but behind the scenes is sort of low profile, not very sexy, high profile stuff that's happening through the agencies. And because the president has had so much support and had a number of executive actions addressing and saying we need to start integrating climate resilience, there's a lot of potential here, which is why I included so many of these more agency-specific, not as straightforward policies. And so for the question I guess you asked about, I think you identified the first one, but what does this general recommendation from the task force actually look like if the Mountain Pact were to work on that. And I think that would take I think the first step would be if we identified them, I'd really dig in and identify the specific drivers and who the decision makers are and how we can start influencing those decision makers. But I think in general, it would be working behind the scenes in terms of how this is being implemented. So Forest Service is going to be integrating this aspect of it. Will be part of the start pushing to be part of the conversation, provide both written feedback, potentially host different meetings with the right decision makers and try to make sure that mountain communities are integrated into how this actually gets implemented. Because right now these are just sort of words that came out of the task force with a lot of top-down support from the president saying we need to do this. And so the agencies are tasked to actually doing it. And so if we can jump in now and say, you should do it, this is great, you should do it like this, and you got to include these mountain communities that have a lot of natural resources and recreational value, I think that was where we could have a lot of influence. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that makes a lot more sense. I was just trying to picture, okay, so we decide to support this. Is that us signing on to something, or is that us sending staff to actually meet with some of these leaders in our community? It sounds like it's probably a combination, but more of the latter.
Yes, I would say it would be more of the latter, and then depending on if there was a specific sign-on, that might come up, but I think one of the benefits of really narrowing down to just a couple policies is that I would have the mandate from you guys to really dissect and understand what is happening with these, who the right people are, and then making sure that we're meeting with the decision makers, we're submitting comments to the decision makers, et cetera.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, so any thoughts? So initially I thought that it would be better to have a discussion to save you guys time in terms of identifying the handful so that we could kind of talk it out a little bit. But I also know that it's a large amount of information and sort of at the surface level as well. The priority ones I pulled from are let's see, I think the first, so the first 7 are ones that I identified as part of the higher priority based on my perspective, and 3 of those are invasive species. So maybe if there's no more general questions, I'll just start by asking you guys. I know that Lake Tahoe is particularly interested in invasive species. Ashley and Matt and Karen, jump in. Would we want to have invasive species as one of the, and resilience around that as one of the priorities for the Mountain Pact in 2015?
I think so. You know, although Aspen's lucky in that we haven't seen a ton of issues with invasive species, I know that our neighboring communities are really struggling with it, and I'm sure it's coming our way at some point. The Forest Service as a whole could probably use some support. So I think it's probably something that we should get on the radar of mountain communities, and then kind of start. I'd love to learn a little bit more about it. I probably know enough to know what we should support and what we shouldn't and all that, but I'd be in support of having it a priority.
Okay.
This is Karen. Yeah, I mean, aquatic invasive species are, you know, a huge priority for the Lake Tahoe region. And, you know, the fact that it looks like this task force recommendation would cover that and more sort of terrestrial invasive species. I mean, I think it should be a priority.
Okay.
And this is Matt. Same thing for Park City. We're real similar to Aspen. We don't have a current issue, but our neighboring resorts are starting to.
Okay. And what about the Wildfire Disaster Funding Act #2? That's something that we have invested in and put a lot of time and energy into in the last few months. And so I think there's an argument that can be made of either continuing to build that momentum, but I could also see if that's something that we wanted to switch gears and go in a different direction as well. What are your interest levels in pursuing the Wildfire Disaster Funding Act?
This is Karen. I think it should stay a high priority just because it has to pass. I mean, it's such an important piece of how we deal with wildfire in the West, and the fact that it already has bipartisan support, I think it'll continue to have support even in the new Congress. It's just a matter of time, I think. So as much as we can push, I think the better.
Okay. Great, and that's something I definitely, you could probably hear this from my tone, but I think that we're so close it makes sense to keep moving forward with this.
Agreed.
Great, and then so wanted to narrow it down to 2 to 4, and so one thing I could do is send out a poll for rating, but I am also sensitive, again, to your time, and if that's something you guys want to do. Are there any of the other 17, was there anyone do you have any comments on them in general, or think there either should be a higher priority or we should just maybe remove them altogether?
This is Matt, and I'd love to hear a little more on the water resiliency piece. I don't know a whole lot about that, so I'd be curious if that fits into your longer term goals. And I know that the Western Adaptation Alliance is focused a lot on water, so it seems like an interesting spot to look.
Absolutely, and water is so key, both as it's going to be very much affected, water infrastructure, by climate change, but also mountain pact communities have an interesting role to play there because you're in many cases closer to the headwaters than you are to the downstream users, and so investment into water infrastructure could end up going in your direction if the policies are designed well. And so the main water policy in this is the slide 12, but it's number 6, which is a recommendation from the task force to provide support on assessments of vulnerability of water infrastructure to climate impacts and incorporate climate change resilience into water resource planning and project design. And so this, because climate resilience is so early or so new in the federal government right now, there's, I think this hasn't, from the research I've done, hasn't been fully articulated on what this actually looks like. But I think that would be something to dig into. That would be, how can we make sure that there is a lot of support coming from the federal level, both with technical support and financial, to make sure that we're integrating climate change resilience into water resource planning, which could include also something like, in the case of Park City, how, I don't know whether, I imagine the Salt Lake City watershed comes from the Wasatch Mountains, but I'm not sure exactly. But anyway, how Salt Lake City plans as an urban area need to make sure that they're incorporating the upstream actual resource of the water. So I guess the Mountain Pact's role there could be in the design and making sure that the upstream and downstream users are connected in that sense.
I'm with Matt. I think there's a huge interest in water when we're talking about any sort of climate planning. So, I mean, I love all of these. I want to support all of them, but definitely something with water. I was also really curious about, let's see, it doesn't have a number, but it's the climate resilience capacity building, the one that supports research programs at looking how climate is affecting agricultural and natural resources. That seems to be the only one on there to me that deals kind of with food and the ag world, which is something I think that we do need a lot more research in. And so I'd personally be interested in following that a little bit more and seeing if there is space to lend some support to that one.
Great. Okay, I'm just looking to pull that one up. Okay, yeah, so I think that's number 9, so how land managers should support federal programs that monitor how climate is affecting agriculture and natural resources. Is that the one you're referencing?
That's what I'm looking at.
Great, okay, so then how support into research around food and natural resources.
And that's something we've talked about too at the, not to keep referencing the Western Adaptation Alliance, but when we talk about water, we've really talked about that connection that water availability has to our ability to grow food and how that makes us a more resilient community. And I think it's just something that we're going to see a lot more in the coming years with local governments needing to know a lot more about climate impacts to food resources. So.
And what is Aspen currently working on any local food and local urban agriculture projects?
We are, but they're really small scale. We're just trying to like figure out what the appropriate role is for government. So we own a ton of land, and there's a big push to start having more ag on that land. So yeah, it's definitely one of the things we are actively working on, but it's also something that we just know nothing about, and it's really new for us. So that kind of speaks to that federal priority too, where if anyone else is in this boat, it'd be really good to know a little bit more about climate impacts to agriculture.
Yeah. Especially imagine in Alpine.
Oh,
sorry, go ahead, Karen.
I would add on to that with just more information about growing, not just effects of climate change, but just more information about growing in mountain, alpine environments too.
Great. And actually, are they greenhouses in Aspen, or is it actually on the just open land?
We have a few greenhouses, but the city owns about 200 acres, so we're about to do a master plan on. And so there's talk of, do we open up it, do we open it up to small scale farmers and do kind of a farm incubator system with the market and all sorts of stuff, and have it be this high altitude growing kind of think tank. But that's just one, and then we have some greenhouse projects and then some like just huge education. We also have a ton of landowners that own so many water rights, and they have, bluegrass out in front of their multi-million-dollar home. And so we're trying to like work with them to, hey, maybe you want to put something equally as pretty, but maybe it's food, and how do we start to educate people about how we can better use our community water resources to go towards food.
Great, that's helpful. All right, so far I've pulled out 4 themes that we've talked about, which are not in order of priority, but in order of conversation, but invasive species, wildfire, water, and food. And I think those, I'd like to narrow it down from there, but for the purposes of this conversation, maybe what I'll do is I'll take what we've talked about and then maybe put it together in a quick poll. I'd really like to have it. Each of these topics are still pretty broad in terms of what specific policy, and I guess I'd like to think about it a little bit more and then maybe send it out for one more round of quick feedback, and then from there. How does that sound?
That works for me. That sounds like a good plan.
Works for me.
Yeah, it works for me as well.
Okay. Well, great. Well, thanks for your ideas and conversation. This is really helpful to guide, and I want to make sure that we are, with the Mountain Pact, finding the balance of doing the work behind the scenes to make your jobs easier, but also making sure that at the beginning of this policy agenda that we are going in the direction that makes the most sense and that aligns with your priorities as a community. So with that, thank you so much for participating. Put in my thank you slide. And I look forward to talking to you guys all over the next, working with you in 2015 and having follow-up conversations just from this meeting.
Hey, Diana, one big question.
Yeah.
So we've got these federal priorities. You're going to send that out. We're going to think about that. Some of this other stuff that we've talked about, like the economic impact assessment and some of those other, 2015 other programmatic things, are we just kind of waiting to hear if we get any more funding, or are we going to try and figure out a way to make those work, or is that at some point is that something you put back out to the members and see if we want to collaborate on some of those on our own, or what are the next steps there?
Yeah, great question. So I think, so for those, going back to slide 4, I think, well, first off, as I am coordinating with a firm that might be interested in collaborating with the Mountain Pact on a economic impact analysis, so I'm going to keep pursuing that and see what that looks like. So I'm thinking in general I would be lightly pursuing all of these at the same time or heavily with the policy agenda. The regular member meetings, I got the sense from this conversation that maybe that would be of interest for a specific topic, and so one thought I have is giving that back to you guys and saying if there's, as they come up, maybe I'll organize another one in about a month and solicit if there's any ideas or really specific topics that you would like to discuss or brainstorm, recognizing too that you do have other forums for that sort of best practice exchange. But maybe make that more of an ad hoc, or if there's ad hoc regular meetings when there's specific topics. So that's the sense I got from you guys. That's what I'm thinking there. And then in terms of building local government capacity, that's just a very early idea, but I want to think about that more. And if you had more ideas on how we can integrate it, or if you feel like if there's ways that I can better support or be sharing the knowledge so that you're also developing that institutionally, I'm very interested in that. But I'm not really sure if there's a clear sort of action item on that at this point. So I guess to put it shortly, I'm going to be keeping pursuing this economic impact research and see with an opportunity now, and I'll keep you posted on that. And then to facilitate regular meetings, do that on an ad hoc basis, and then local government capacity is on hold or as ideas come up. How does that sound?
That sounds good. Matt, if you're still out there and you find another oil person who needs to do penance, I'd love an ecosystem services analysis for Aspen. Or if you want to combine efforts on that, let me know.
It's the same woman I sent you guys for CDP, and so I'll talk to you.
Yeah, if offline, if you want to partner on that, I'd be interested. So
perfect.
Cool. Well, great. Well, thank you guys, and I'll be following up in the next few days with more of this, and look forward to coordinating and getting this policy agenda nailed down.
Thanks so much for all your work, Diana.
Thank you. Okay. Bye-bye.